this notebook with you. You can open and just follow me through it. And we will discuss some general concepts in multi-views, in creating complex views, combining several charts, and interactivity, selecting stuff, filtering stuff, and we will try to combine multi-views and interactivity in order to create some interesting dashboards that should help us to navigate through this data set and to find something interesting. And in the end, you'll have 4 exercises related to these 2 concepts. So we will continue working with this Pitchfork dataset. I hope that you're familiar with it at this point. So I won't explain dataset again, right? So we'll just start with this concept. And we'll start with this multi-views concept. So usually, whenever we work with data visualization, we are not interested in just one chart, right? Usually we're interested in combining several layers of information or several different presentations of data visualization. Because as we've seen before on previous sessions, each data presentation, each data visualization gives us like a certain view on our data, right? So it helps us to see our data in a different way. And as we've seen before, each data visualization helps us to see something in our data, but also it might hide something from our data. That's why we usually need more than one data presentation. So we'll start with this multi-views idea. And you're already familiar with some of these multi-views concepts, right? So these multi-views includes faceting, for instance, and layering. And from our previous sessions, you should be already familiar with faceting and layering. So faceting is basically way of splitting our data into several groups and making charts, like same charts for each subgroup. And we can use faceting in order to declutter our graphics, right? To be able to see each line on our chart and to distinguish between them. Last time we were discussing these 2 different approaches, like spaghetti chart, when we can see all lines on one presentation, or faceting, when we can see each line separately. So basically, that's the idea of faceting. And there are several additional concepts you should be aware of. Right? So whenever we create facets, we work with this idea of layout, right? So in this case, I can define my facet and I can say, okay, let's split our data by one variable, primary general, right? And let's organize our facets into 5 columns, right? So, and we discussed last time, I believe, that this layout is really important for us because it defines how we can compare our data. Like, it defines dimensions for us. So we can define this layout by just selecting, by adjusting these columns or rows parameter. In this case, I can say, I want to compare all our data just on one scale, right? So I have to adjust width and number of columns. So it's going to be easier for me to compare all our charts in one scale. Sometimes that's not enough. I mean, we have huge disparity between different genres here, and some genres are visible, like rap, rock, metal, and everything else, and some are not, right? So that's why whenever we work with facets, we have this idea of shared or independent scales, right? So in this case, we have shared Y scale. So on every chart we create, we have Y scale that starts from 0 and ends on 500, right? So that's what we call shared Y scale. Or we can say, okay, we don't want to compare all charts in pairs or through, but we want to see each line, and we want to be able to see this dynamic for each line. In this case, we can say, okay, we don't want Y scale to be shared. We want it to be independent. And in this case, we're gonna use separate scale for each of our facets. Of course, it has some advantages for us because we are able to see each line separately, and we can see this dynamics, this progression, even for lines when there are not that much data points. But of course, we have another problem here, that it's hard for us to compare data between facets. And we have this additional mental work because like, I don't know how you perceive it, but I know that we have independent scales here, but my mind expects them to be shared, right? So that's like additional line of work for me to keep track that they are independent in this case. So I don't have to compare them in wild scales. So that's something that creates additional problems for us. And that's something that our users should be aware of. Like, whenever we have independent Y scale or independent whatever scale, our users should be aware of it. Like, we should give them a signal of some kind. So there are two different concepts, like layout and scales. And you should be aware of these concepts. And also another thing that we should be aware of is sorting. Whenever we create these facets, we should organize them in some way. So in this case, we can say, okay, let's have rock on the first facet because it has more reviews than anything else, and organize our facets in a meaningful way to distinguish between important data and non-important data. So, of course, there are more layouts than we can afford in VegaLite or Altair concept. So in these two frameworks, we are allowed at this point to have just these rows and columns for faceting. But you should be aware of more options, and you should know that you can use them creatively. So rows and columns, I hope you got the idea at this point. Rep, that's like the same idea of rows and columns, but basically we have this wrapping. If we want to say, okay, we want to have 10 facets, but just 5 columns. And Altair will wrap our facets on the second row for us. So basically that's wrapping our facets. But there are more interesting concepts for faceting for us. And one of the most popular in the last couple of years, probably geofaceting. So we have this idea of combining maps and facets. And we have this idea that we can organize our facets in a way that follows the map. So basically, in this case, each facet positioned accordingly to map of USA, right? So we try to create this grid of facets and locate them in a way that corresponds to their location on a map. And that's a really powerful idea because whenever we want to combine these geospatial data and, for instance, comparison or change in time or proportions, it's really hard to work with maps. I mean, we can facet maps as well. We can create like a few small maps, but it's really hard to keep track of change of separate maps. And here comes geofaceting, right? So it's currently unavailable in VigaLite and Altair. Probably you can work something around it because you really, what you need to create is this grid, and you have to come up with idea how to position your facets on this grid and how to create some spaces. So no charts at some points, but probably you can come up with some ideas. And there are some, so this is like implementation for R in ggplot. There are some implementations for D3 for sure. So you can work something out. For sure, you can create something like this in Altair or VigaLite because that's easier. We don't have separate charts in each rectangle, in each tile. So that's something really easy to do probably. But it's gonna be harder for us to combine data in this geofaceting manner. But that solves so many problems in terms of presenting data and combining maps and charts. Another idea of faceting comes from great JavaScript library called G2. I don't remember if I mentioned this library for you before. Basically, that's like an implementation of grammar graphics and JavaScript made by Alibaba, Alipay, and all this set of companies. And they have this really nice framework for data visualization. There are not that many companies and developers using this framework in Western countries, but it's really nice in terms of capabilities. And what I like in particular is their implementation of facets. So for instance, here they have this facet tree that allows us to see some kind of hierarchy in our data. So in this case, we can have our full data frame, and then we have two categories, and we can have subcategories. And for each level of this hierarchy, we can see facet. And that they have these pie charts example here, but of course we are not limited to what we can put into this tree, and that's a really nice idea.